Is the Council on Foreign Relations. This program was recorded Monday in New York City.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being so prompt. I'm Donnie Fussell, and I've got a pleasant task here this evening. I want to commend all of you for coming to this meeting tonight. The subject matter is certainly timely and vital, and our speaker is right in the middle of it. He is a quintessential public servant. I've known him for many years in the most favorable light, as many of you here in this room also know him. He's been recognized by presidents of both political parties. He has served his country with great distinction in just about every job that I can think of, in state and defense and CIA. And so many things are so important, and Frank has done them all. But I think I would have to just dwell on one aspect of all of the great honors that he's achieved, and rightly so, and that is when he was ambassador to Portugal. I think that needs to go down in the history books of the United States. And Frank Carlucci deserves the great measure of credit for turning that situation around. And after a distinguished, multi and varied career in the United States government, he decided to go do something else, and he wasn't there very long before once again the country called on him, and once again, because he's that kind of person, he responded quickly in a very difficult situation. I will say that the White House was besieged, and they needed somebody like Frank Carlucci to come in there and straighten it out, give it some stability, do the things that had to be done, fire people, take charge, make the administrative changes that had to be made, and otherwise try to put some rational thought into this very, very delicate and important process. He comes to us as a man with great talent, tremendous dedication, really unusual American, and I'm proud to present now Special Assistant to the President in charge of National Security Affairs, Frank Carlucci.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for that overly flattering introduction. It's a great honor for me to just be introduced by someone of the stature of Danny Fussell. He's a man who truly deserves all our respect. It's also a pleasure for me to look around the room and see so many friends. If I'm not careful, I'll just keep nodding as I go around here tonight, as I recognize new faces, friends I'm delighted to see. I also identify some experts on the subject that I'm going to speak on, so that I view that with some trepidation. Actually, I was billed as coming to talk to you about the Persian Gulf, but given the intensity of interest and given the fact that we have some Soviet experts here, I thought I'd comment as well on our dialogue with the Soviets as we approach the summit meeting.
Frank, could I interrupt you just for a second? In case somebody did not get to know this, this is not the usual kind of meeting. This is on the record, and therefore, I just want you to know, and it's also being covered by TV for the first time.
Yeah, I want you also to know that's at your request, not mine. The chairman very kindly mentioned some of the changes that have taken place at the NSC, and I'm going to apologize a little bit if my remarks on the Persian Gulf seem to dwell perhaps too much on process, but I think the process of foreign policy formulation is important, and it's clearly one that I know you are all interested in. It is true that we have changed procedures, we've changed the organizational structure of the NSC. We've had a complete review of covert action programs. The President has personally reviewed all of the covert action programs. We've worked with the congressional committees on setting up a new process for covert action, and we have done the standard things that one does when one inherits a new organization. But the process is really at the heart of the NSC, and we've tried to structure the mechanism so that the decisions are flushed up more readily and implemented more steadily. We've, in addition to the NSC and what is called the NSPG, which is basically a smaller NSC, we have plugged in a new element. And this was suggested by the Tower Commission, but actually we anticipated it, which is a meeting at basically the deputy or undersecretary level, chaired very ably by my deputy, Lieutenant General Colin Powell. I recall that the Carter administration had somewhat the same mechanism, and it worked, because that provides the link between the famous IG-SIG structure, which is a labyrinth, and the actual cabinet level deliberations. And we like to think that the decisions are flowing smoothly and in a somewhat self-serving way. I'll claim that you haven't seen many articles in the past year on administration's arms control policy, for example, in disarray. Sure, there are differences, but at least we've gotten away from describing it as being in disarray. Actually, for what it's worth, and I recognize that one has to discount a certain amount of this, one of the Soviet officials told me the other day that one of the reasons that they felt the process was now moving along so quickly was that decisions in Washington were being made rather rapidly, and they were hoping that the pace would continue. Let me argue also that we made deliberate, considered decisions on the Persian Gulf. And the President was intimately involved in every step of the way. Indeed, I think it's fair to say that he has chaired more NSC meetings on the Persian Gulf than any other single subject. And I would argue, and I'm sure there are those in this room who will argue with me, that the overall results have been positive, unless, of course, you think that one shouldn't take any military risks at all in defense of our strategic interests. But Shia expansionism has been contained. Our relationships with the Gulf states are good, and the allies are cooperating. Now, nothing is perfect, of course. No policy formulation is perfect, and we've had the unexpected in the Persian Gulf, and I'm sure we'll have the unexpected in the future. But in my judgment, at least, the key to good policy, sound policy, is not to let the unexpected deter you, to be able to accommodate to it and continue to strive toward your goals. Now, let me take you back for a minute to late 1986 and early 1987, where it's no secret we had a credibility problem in the region. Iranian troops were poised outside of Basra, and Kuwait was willing to turn toward the Soviet Union for assistance. We examined this policy closely, concluded that we needed urgently to restore some consistency and stability to the process. And a number of meetings were held, resulting in presidential statements on January 23rd and February 25th, explicitly laying out the policy. Support for freedom of navigation, continued supply of oil, and that means over land as well as by sea, support for the moderate Arab states in meeting their legitimate security aspirations without upsetting the Arab-Israeli balance, and trying to bring about an end to the Iran-Iraq war without victor or vanquished. And it is in the context of that policy that one has to look at the reflagging decision and the decision to sell arms to the moderate Arab states. The Congress at the time was fond of talking about our reflagging policy. Reflagging was not a policy, as most of you in this room recognize. Other nations have every right under our Merchant Marine Act of 1980 to reflag their ships. Allowing them to go forward seemed to be perfectly consistent with the policy goals that we had laid out. It also seemed to be well within the limits of risk. We didn't get any negative vibrations at the time, and we consulted with the Congress. We didn't hear any negative vibrations, at least not substantial ones, out of Iran. And by and large, what we were doing met with the approval of the Gulf states, not without reservations on the part of some, but as I say, it was well within the normal risk limits. And the JCS saw no need to increase substantially our forces in the Gulf. At the same time, we made a conscious decision to push ahead on the diplomatic track. You may recall George Shultz came up for the meeting of the Security Council, and our mission here, led by Dick Walters and Herb Oken, who's here tonight, did just an outstanding job in working Resolution 598 through the process. So we had some diplomatic balance to our military activities in the Gulf. We were very conscious at the time of the need to keep congressional and public support. We were conscious of the need to consult with the Europeans, and yet at the same time convince Iran that we were there to stay, that we weren't about to be driven out of a body of water that we had been in since World War II. Of course, you all know what happened. The Stark incident occurred, and we had the photos of the President consoling the bereaved families. And that kind of thing naturally arouses concern. But no one could talk the President out of going down and consoling the families. But it brought a sense of alarm, and it led to some exploitation of the situation. And the Iranians made no secret about it, that their goal was to exploit our internal political differences, to drive us out, as they said, of the Gulf, just like they drove us out of Lebanon. And as I say, their chosen instrument was really political warfare with a military accompaniment. We, at the time, reviewed our policy again. We became convinced that any alteration of that policy would be a serious mistake. It would adversely affect our credibility in the region, indeed in the world, and that we should press forward. We improved our force structure in the area. We intensified our consultations. I myself went to Europe during that period. And we held up on the escorting until the Joint Chiefs reported to us that they were fully prepared to handle the contingencies. And then, of course, Bridgeton occurred. Quite frankly, that was, in my judgment at least, a lucky strike. One can argue, oh, the Navy should have foreseen that there would be mines in that area. There had not been any up to that point. One can argue that we should have had minesweepers, although minesweepers were really a function of other NATO countries under NATO doctrine. But nonetheless, it sparked off the same debate that we had had before. We continued on our course, adapting to the mine situation, with helicopters and minesweepers and intensified our consultation with our allies to the point where today we have British, French, Belgian, Dutch, Italian vessels in the Gulf. Indeed, there are more foreign vessels in the Gulf than there are military vessels, and there are U.S. military vessels at the current time. And the British are doing exactly the same thing we are doing, including reflagging some Kuwaiti ships. We gained additional support from our allies in the Gulf. And they are very shy about talking about this in public for obvious reasons, because they're uncertain about our staying power. They look at our internal debates and they say, we know we need to help you, and we will help you. But please keep it off the front pages. But I can say to you that the degree of support that we are getting is unprecedented. Indeed, I dare say it'd be unthinkable in the days in which Shai Meyer and I were in the Pentagon. But nonetheless, we had a very active and intensive war powers debate on the Hill. Fortunately, that seems to have subsided a bit recently, and I think we can claim that we are a nation looking at the Gulf now with steady nerves, that we do have a military presence, an allied presence, that is capable of coping with the threat, that we have, as I said earlier, accomplished our overall policy goals, or are on the way to accomplishing our overall policy goals. Indeed, there are public opinion polls that say our credibility in the area has never been higher. Well, is it open-ended? Question we frequently get. It's open-ended in the sense that the U.S. Navy will have an obligation to protect U.S. flagged vessels in international waters wherever they are, and wherever they are threatened. But we do hope to be able to reduce our presence through our diplomatic activities. Dick Walters is over at the UN right now receiving the report of the Secretary General. Based on the statements that Rafsanjani made yesterday, I don't hold much hope for that report. And clearly, if it's unfavorable, we intend to push even harder for the follow-on resolution imposing sanctions on the recalcitrant party, which, of course, to date has been Iran. Before I leave this subject, let me just offer some reflections on the War Powers Act, because it has occupied a substantial amount of my time the past month and a half, and I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not an expert on it. But just looking at the purposes for which we use military force, it seems to me that we have to re-examine this act, because what we are saying, the instant we put military forces in any region, is that we may well pull them out. And the essence of a military operation is to demonstrate resolve and staying power. And if you say that there's an automatic pullout 60 or 90 days hence, unless the Congress votes, you're telling your adversary to fight like hell during that period, and you're telling your friends not to help you. Rafsanjani has even commented publicly on that, saying to the other Gulf states, look at the war powers debate. I don't think the U.S. will be able to stay the course in the Gulf. Moreover, the War Powers Act contemplates something in the abstract. And no two military situations are the same. Each have to be treated on an ad hoc basis. Well, then there's the argument that it's the law of the land. So why don't you obey it? And indeed, we have sent up reports which are similar, the same kind of reports that were used in Lebanon, Grenada, the Iran rescue operation, because nobody has recognized the constitutionality of certain provisions of the act. But clearly there are limits to laws which the executive branch can accept and implement. If the Congress were to pass a law censoring CBS and to override a presidential veto, would the president be obliged to implement that law? Obviously not. So the Congress cannot, by statute, in our judgment, alter the fundamental relationship between the executive and legislative branches. But I'll defer to the lawyers among you for further argument on that score. Let me move on and say a word about our relations with the Soviets. And because to some of the Soviet experts in this room it may seem like a new world. First of all, the mechanics of the summit as best we know them. Foreign Minister Shevardnadze asked for a working summit. So all of those who are prepared, those of you who are prepared to invite Gorbachev to this function or that function, can spare yourself a letter writing chore, because they've indicated that they really want 3 days on business, without prejudice to the presidential visit to Moscow, they said, being another kind of visit, or subsequent visits by Gorbachev to the United States. But they felt, this is the way they put it, that there was just a lot going on in the Soviet Union right now, and 3 days was the most that the General Secretary could afford to spend in this country. I watch television programs and I hear a lot of questions about what happened in Moscow. I don't know. I'm prepared to defer to the Soviet experts on that. We have a lot of theories that there are internal developments that bore on the General Secretary's decision not to set a date when we were there, that we were non-responsive to some of the things he said, or that he thought he could negotiate a little further than we were prepared to go on SDI. Some of these aren't mutually inconsistent. But sometimes I think we tend to overanalyze the USSR. As we sat there, I could see the General Secretary more or less going through the process of backing off in his own mind. But at the same time, he said very clearly 2 or 3 times, I want to come to the United States, I want a summit. I'm just not comfortable making the decision on timing now. Well, for whatever reason, it is water over the dam. But the Moscow conference was a very productive conference, and there is a decidedly new tone to our relationship with the Soviets. Let me just cite you one example. In the last evening, we were debating an INF verification issue, and we were claiming that 2 missiles were at least similar, if not interchangeable. And the Soviets said, no, the dimensions of these missiles are different. One was a strategic missile, the other was an INF missile. And they pulled out the diagrams with the dimensions of the missiles on them and passed them around for us to examine to prove their point. Or in Washington, Mr. Shevardnadze came prepared to discuss the agenda, and he opened. And he said, here is what I would like to see as an agenda for the summit. And true, he put the usual arms control items on the agenda, but he immediately went on to say, and yes, we want a very full discussion of human rights and a discussion of regional issues as well. His initiative. And if you cast your mind's eye back a bit, you will recall that that 4-part agenda, if you add bilateral relations, has been our agenda all along. The Soviets have wanted a pure arms control agenda. So they have really come around to accepting our complete agenda. And I would submit to you that that's substantial progress. Not that there aren't a lot of sticking points and very difficult issues to be resolved. Human rights, we've seen some modest improvement, but Jewish emigration is only at the rate of about 800 or 900 a month, although they claim they're going to get it up to 10 or 11,000 this year, but this is still far short of 1979 under Brezhnev, when there were some 55,000 Jewish immigrants. They've got a long way to go on human rights, and they've got a long way to go before they can demonstrate that they are entitled to have a human rights conference in Moscow. But nonetheless, we want to work with them, and we readily accepted their proposal that the deputy foreign ministers meet before the summit to try and resolve individual outstanding human rights issues. Their proposal, mind you. In the regional area, we've got even more obstacles. We continue to hear nice words on Afghanistan, but we see more Soviet troops there than ever, and we do not see them backing off. Indeed, we had some spirited discussions in areas such as Central America. Nonetheless, we are able, in the context of this relationship now, to have that kind of spirited discussion without anybody stomping out of the room. Indeed, with the Soviets saying, we want to have more of that. Their approach during this meeting to arms control and summitry was also interesting. They didn't start with INF. They said, we want to start with the Moscow summit, where we would like the President of the United States to come and sign a START treaty. And let's work back from there. And we had, as we had had in Moscow, a very good discussion on START. And I may be going out a bit on a limb here, and this is purely a personal prediction. I think the issue of sublimits in START is a resolvable issue. On verification, we agreed that we should move ahead right now, intensively, at Geneva, to study the verification issues. Sure, they continue to link START to defense and space. But once again, the tone has changed. They no longer, at least in these discussions, talk about killing SDI. Indeed, they say, well, we recognize SDI is your program. We're not going to talk about that. We want to talk about the ABM treaty. And there are a lot of problems with the way they talk about the ABM treaty, yes. But we are coming to agreement on a concept of non-withdrawal. Not on a number of years, but a concept of non-withdrawal from the ABM treaty. They've changed their position on such things as research in space ever so slightly. Long way to go on defense and space. But once again, the dialogue is very good. One concern that I will share with you quite openly as we go through these negotiations is what is happening, Mr. Chairman, on the Hill with, and I don't mean to personalize this because I know you've been very supportive, the arms control amendments. The Soviets are more than aware of them. They follow them very closely. And there may be good and sound reasons, or are perhaps legitimate legal differences on the interpretation of the ABM treaty, but I would argue that this has now become a national security issue more than a legal issue. I, for the life of me, can't see the merit of imposing SALT II sublimits on us when we are coming very close to negotiating real reductions on START, nor can I see the merit of restricting us on nuclear testing when we're about to start negotiations, nuclear testing, and indeed have made good progress in getting the Soviets to move toward our agenda in this area. What I am submitting is that it is very damaging in the context of these negotiations to have the Congress pushing us toward the Soviet position. I think this is a resolvable issue. I've had some constructive conversations with the chairman of the two Armed Services Committee, chairman and ranking minority members of the two Armed Services Committee, House and Senate, and I think we can come to a meeting of the minds on this issue. I'm optimistic that we can find ways of meeting the legitimate congressional desire, and it is legitimate, to be a player in all of this and still add to our negotiating position and flexibility that we need. INF, yes, we are very close. There are some outstanding issues in the verification area, but I think those are resolvable. Some of the criticism is beginning to mount. And I think as we look at this agreement, very important that we go back to its origins. And many of you in this room are very familiar with its origins. Indeed, some of you participated in its origination. Back to 1979, when the Soviets began to deploy the SS-20s. And we came together as an alliance on the dual-track decision. And when we went ahead with deployment, the Soviets walked out of the arms negotiations. Everybody said the world's coming to an end. We persisted. The Soviets came back. In the Reagan administration, the president came up with the zero option. Everybody said it's out of the question. You'll never do it. Better back off. We persisted. Soviets wanted to hang on to 100. Everybody said you better let them have 100. We persisted. They backed off on the 100. Then there was criticism of verification, and the Soviets came very far on the verification regime. There are many benefits, it seems to me, to an INF agreement. One is that it demonstrates that alliance cohesion can produce results. Now, I'm not going to argue that there haven't been any strains in the alliance as a result of this. Clearly, there have been some tensions, but I would argue that these are basically political and they are manageable. And I myself have participated in a number of discussions on that subject. Secondly, it establishes a precedent of actually reducing a class of weaponry. But more important than that, it establishes the principle of asymmetry. And based on the most recent figures the Soviets have given us, and we have exchanged data already, that ratio will be somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 1. And I submit that that is a very good ratio. Third, this will be the most intrusive on-site inspection regime in the history of arms control. We're talking about on-site inspection of assembly facilities, operating bases, disassembly facilities, repair facilities. We're talking about, as I said, exchange of data, all in addition to national technical means. All these things have been agreed upon. Sure, we're still arguing over the number of inspections and how many hours notice and those kinds of details, but we can solve those details. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, it will establish an atmosphere and a verification precedent for a START agreement. Now, don't ask this agreement to carry too much freight. Sure, you can circumvent it if the Soviets want to build another 600 SS-25s. It would seem kind of foolish because they have resource constraints as well for them to sign this agreement, suddenly turn around while they're negotiating START and build some more strategic missiles to compensate. But this was not designed to solve the strategic balance. That's the purpose of START. So looked at it in terms of its own goals, I submit that the INF agreement is a very good agreement. And I would hope that we would not have substantial problems on ratification. Clearly, the Senate has an important role, and we welcome that role. Clearly, it will come under a good deal of scrutiny. And maybe there will be some flaws in it, although we're working very hard to prevent that. But I think it's important that the Senate make an overall evaluation. Is it a good treaty or is it a bad treaty? And that we avoid the kind of killer amendments that were mentioned on a TV show the other day. I think Senator Cranston pointed out the risk of killer amendments. We want to avoid those kinds of amendments, because if that happens, it really will impact adversely on our ability to deal in the future with the Soviets. Make no mistake about it. They make no secret of their concern for ratification. Indeed, they say that's one of the reasons they want to deal with a conservative administration, because they feel more comfortable on the ratification issue there. So ratification is extremely important in terms of the overall context of our relationships with the Soviets. Let me close by just noting that I think there are opportunities in both areas that I have discussed tonight. But those opportunities are built on an aggressive foreign policy undergirded by a strong national security and a vigorous economic and security assistance program and an active State Department. I've been part of the budget discussions on the Hill the past week, and I recognize the deficit problem. But I'm sure most of you in this room would agree with me when I say this is no time for the United States to be pulling back from the world, just when things are beginning to move in a positive direction. We need vigorous and continuous public and congressional support for what we are doing in the foreign policy area on a bipartisan basis. And as a member of the CFR, I'm very proud of being part of an organization that is doing such an excellent job in helping to bring about that kind of public support. Thank you very much.
Frank, thank you very much for that overview. We'll have some time for questions. Would you be kind enough just to, we can't see from up here, so if you just introduce yourself and state your question, that would help everybody.
I'm Evan Galbraith. Given the fact that we do not know how many SS-20 were built or are being built, and given the fact that these missiles are mobile and that their launchers are mobile, by definition, we cannot verify the absence of such missiles. And it seems to me that holding this treaty out as a verifiable treaty is going to sow the seeds of its destruction in the Senate, because this concept cannot logically be put over.
I don't think I held it out as verifiable. I think what I said was that this would be the most intrusive verification regime in the history of arms control. You cannot talk in absolute terms on verifiability. I agree with you. You can make assessments of probabilities on verifiability, and that's what was done in the SALT deliberations. It is, you're right, it is much harder to verify mobile missiles than it was to verify fixed site missiles, as was envisaged in SALT II. Nonetheless, over a period of time, your verification probabilities increase. As to the first part of your question, the exchange of data that we've had with the Soviets has been reviewed by the experts, the intelligence experts, once again within the range of probabilities of their verification capability. And there are various ways of looking at this, which I can't really get into. And they have said that the number that they have given to us is within the range of probability. Frankly, it's a higher number than we had anticipated they would give to us. But in terms of what we're going to do on verification, it will be the maximum one can do. But nobody can guarantee 100% verification on any treaty, and it's a question of weighing the risk of verification error against the risk of a continuing buildup.
Yeah, sure.
I'm Dankert Roster. Back to the Persian Gulf. The administration has stated, and you reminded us today, that the purpose was to protect neutral shipping in international waters. My question is whether that, in effect, is not an open invitation to Iran to attack in territorial waters, as indeed they did just very recently. And isn't it true that the destruction of supertanker docking facilities in Kuwait will do far more damage to the flow of oil than hitting any one tanker?
Well, it is not our purpose to protect neutral shipping in international waters. We are protecting American flag vessels in international waters, and we have steadfastly maintained that that is provocative to no one. That is not an aggressive act. It is a traditional function of the U.S. Navy. Iran has chosen to attack neutral shipping. They've used our presence as an excuse, but that is all that it is an excuse. Yes, obviously missile attacks on Kuwaiti port facilities can be damaging to the flow of oil, but Kuwait has the ability to deal with that. It is not impossible to shoot down a silkworm missile. It's a subsonic missile, rather SOFIing missile, and Kuwait currently has the air defense capability to cope with it. It is a question of helping them deploy that capability so that they are well positioned to stop these missile attacks.
To Cuba, still in the Middle East, would you comment upon the recent trip of the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs to Iran from the USSR?
Yes, Foreign Minister Vorontsov, Deputy Foreign Minister Vorontsov has just been in, I think, both Iran and Iraq. We are, quite frankly, disappointed that the Soviets have not moved more aggressively on the follow-on Resolution 2598. We don't think they've played a constructive role in the Middle East or in the Gulf. They are obviously now seeking to exploit a target of opportunity, trying to act as a go-between, trying to convince Iran that it's a newfound friend, at the same time trying to continue their equities with Iraq and the Arab states. I don't think they can carry water on both shoulders very long. I think the Arabs are becoming disenchanted with this. I don't think anybody is intrigued with the Soviet idea of, at this point, a military UN peacekeeping force. So I think they're playing a bit of an obstructionist role, and we hope that we can have further discussions with them on this subject. We have discussed the Gulf with them, both in Moscow and here, but in order for us to be able to go further, we had to await the Secretary General's report, which, as I indicated, is just coming out tonight. Take one right now.
My name is Roland Paul. Returning to the question of the INF Treaty, as you know, Mr. Carlucci, one of the arguments against it is it enhances the Soviets' conventional threat in Europe. And it certainly seems like that's one of the reasons why the Russians are willing to agree at this level on nuclear weapons to eliminate this class. Do you believe that is one of the reasons, or one of the main reasons why the Russians are willing to go forward with this treaty, and why should we not be worried about it itself?
No, I don't view it as enhancing their conventional capability. They've got overwhelming conventional superiority in any event. I think the main reason is they did not like the idea of the Pershing II striking the Soviet homeland. In fact, they've made that quite clear. But I agree with you that it does make it all the more important that we move forward to address the conventional imbalance. And the Soviets have indicated a willingness to negotiate with us. Of course, you're familiar that we've been doing this for years in MBFR without results, but we're now moving to this new forum, the Atlantic to the Urals Forum. We've spent a good amount of time this past year trying to get our own NATO act together, but I think that has now happened, and we need to begin to move aggressively in the conventional area. But once again, the fact that the INF agreement sets a precedent for asymmetries will be very useful in the conventional area where the asymmetries are even greater.
Warner Schilling, I'd like to hear you a bit more on your problem with the War Powers Act. Surely it's grounded somewhere on the power of the Congress to declare war, and if the administration's policy can't hold up under congressional debate and cannot receive support of the Congress, why shouldn't it be abandoned?
Well, I have no objection to congressional debate. The Congress could pass a resolution tomorrow pulling us out of the Persian Gulf. They could cut off the money. They have plenty of power. Indeed, I would encourage them to have a debate on our Persian Gulf policy. I'd encourage them to vote tomorrow. We'd accept that. What I don't like is a 60 to 90-day string on our policy. And that's the part that the lawyers say is of dubious constitutionality because it's an automatic pullout unless they vote 60 to 90 days hence. So by all means, play a role. We welcome a congressional role, but let's play a role in a way that we can function as a united nation instead of appearing to be divided every time we are using the military in defense of our strategic interests. Let me move over here.
Norma Gloverman, back to the Persian Gulf. We like to think, or I guess the administration likes to think, of Iran as an outcast country, or as becoming an outcast country. I wonder if you would discuss the status, Iran's status vis-a-vis important other players with special effect for Japan and China. Because my understanding is that Japan and China are lending quite a bit of support to Iran, which is creating problems for us.
Well, I think the world community, as evidenced by Resolution 598, is beginning to isolate Iran. Certainly they are isolated in the Middle East. The only sense in which one could argue that Japan is providing any kind of support is if they buy Iranian oil. On the other hand, Japan has just stepped up its loans to some of the moderate Gulf Arab states. They are stepping up their host nation support as compensation for some of our military activities in the Gulf. So we don't really have any quarrel with Iran's posture, or Japan's posture. We, of course, would like them to stop buying Iranian oil. They have agreed that they wouldn't compensate for our cutoff of Iranian oil. China, I have to say, we're disappointed that we continue to see substantial Chinese arms sales to Iran. We have protested these to the Chinese. We will continue to protest them vigorously because it is vitally important that we work with all countries, and China's not just the only one, but they are the largest one, that are selling weaponry to Iran.
My name is Alfred Ogden. Where can we get published information on the different types of weapons and their capabilities on this INF, country by country, weapon by weapon?
Well, most of that kind of information is available now in terms of the weapons that would be taken down, and I have my public affairs person here with me, and he'd be glad to help you out on that. We can provide you with the information, the kinds of missiles. Take one now.
Henry Graff, Mr. Carlucci, would you care to comment on the level of the President's personal involvement in the technical details of the INF Treaty?
Let me just say, I have not been involved in the technical details of the INF Treaty, so I wouldn't expect the President to be involved. He has been very deeply immersed in the major decisions, indeed. He probably knows more about the Pershing 1A problem than any president would care to know about, because we've talked to him at length about this. He has conversed extensively with Helmut Kohl on the subject. He's very well acquainted with the missiles that are being taken down, the path of the negotiations. In each case, before we've had a foreign minister's visit, before George Shultz has gone to Moscow, and before Shevardnadze came here, the President chaired an NSC meeting reviewing the entire negotiating position and blessing it before we went into the negotiations. In addition to that, I would say I talked to him about arms control issues, both INF and START, at least twice and maybe even 3 times a week. So he's very well acquainted with the kinds of issues that are presidential level. But it would not be appropriate for him or me or George Shultz or anybody else to get into technical details. That's up to the negotiators. Let me take one back.
No, I'll take it. I'm sorry.
I guess there is a war in the Gulf between Iran and Iraq. Could you share with us your ideas of how that war is going to end? From looking from what we see, the Iranians are willing to pay the price for this policy. Iraq is not winning, and they just have to sit and wait year, 2 years, 3 years, and they will win. What is the United States doing to make them think that this is not going to be the outcome?
You may recall in my earlier comments when I mentioned the presidential statements in January and February, I hope I said that we explained, at least I did personally, in meeting the White House press corps, that one of our goals was to stop the spread of Iranian hegemonism, Shia expansionism. We've made no bones about that. We're not joining sides in the war. Our official posture is one of neutrality. We are the ones who have pushed hardest for the UN resolution to bring about a ceasefire, as we said, without victor or vanquished, withdraw to national borders, exchange of prisoners, the whole thing. We think that the world community just has to keep working at Iran to demonstrate to them that the kind of expansionist course on which they're embarked in the Gulf will not succeed and will not pay dividends. At the same time, I think they need to be allowed the possibility of having a dialogue in the UN with the world community so that the Secretary General and others working with him can look for mutually satisfactory solutions to the problem. I would hazard a guess, I'd wager you, however, that it would not contribute to the solution of this problem for us to accept the Iranian position, which is they would stop attacking ships in the Gulf. The U.S. just withdrew from the Gulf. But that would not only impact adversely on the situation in the Gulf, but on our ability to protect U.S. shipping worldwide. Not that you suggested that, but I would argue that the combination of protection to shipping, allied shipping, because as I mentioned, we have allied forces in the Gulf, coupled with the diplomatic activities right here in New York, will ultimately offer a solution.
Looking ahead at the margins of safety following an arms agreement, an INF agreement, perhaps even a START, on our side, what we have left, of course,
is a rather formidable sea power, nuclear sea power, which I assume we feel is in reserve if things go wrong. On the Soviet side, of course, they have the conventional superiority. How do we propose to handle the safety measure of our nuclear capability at sea? By adding sea power, nuclear sea power, to the NATO defense structure, or will that be reserved for the American command? And at the same time, then, how does one foresee, or how the Soviet attitudes in dealing with the possible integration of the French and the British nuclear capabilities, which presumably they want to maintain themselves?
In regard to the latter portion of your question, I don't think the French or the British would like to talk about integration of their nuclear capabilities, certainly at this stage. It is very hard for us to put, in fact, I don't think we would, put strategic weapons under a NATO command. There are currently nuclear submarines which can aid in the defense of Europe. But since they also have a strategic capability, it would be inappropriate for us to put them under a NATO command.
A START agreement which reduced the Soviet forces by 50% would obviously be a major achievement. But in looking somewhat beyond that, I wonder whether we're planning for our future weapons. The Scowcroft Commission in 1983 and 1984 advocated single warhead midget men and smaller nuclear submarines. We don't really want to end up with 2 or 4 Triton submarines in the ocean. Are we planning ahead, doing the development required for more survivable weapons?
As we go through the arms control process, the Joint Chiefs, and there's a former member of them sitting right next to you, look at military sufficiency all along the way. They spend a lot of time doing this, and their reports come up to the president. I don't think looking at this problem, you should not assume that you have to compensate for everything that is brought down, because obviously the other side is bringing down too. So we have to develop a mentality that says, how do you construct a new deterrent? And one point that has been lost in this equation is the shift in the concept of deterrence. From a deterrence built on the MAD doctrine to a deterrence built on a combination of offense and defense, at least initially. Interesting now that the Soviets accept that concept, and they're quite open about it. They are also talking, instead of talking about SDI as such, they're talking about stability and predictability. And these are concepts that we can work with. And so we have to look at future force structures in terms of strategic stability as well as military sufficiency, and these studies are going on in the Joint Chiefs. Well, you have one. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you said before that there's been discussion with the Soviets on non-withdrawal from the ABM treaty. It seems the key question really is the interpretation of the treaty. Is this administration prepared to alter its view of the so-called broad interpretation for some period of time?
As a legal matter, no. We have asserted the broad interpretation, but we have structured the program to date to conform to the narrow interpretation. And Judge Sophia, the State Department has put out a series of studies on the interpretation of the treaty, in which he asserts that the broad interpretation is the legally correct interpretation. In our judgment, if we are obliged to follow the so-called traditional or narrow interpretation, what the Soviets are now calling strict interpretation, but it's very similar to the narrow interpretation at this point since they've modified their position a bit. This would encumber the SDI program in an unacceptable manner. It would slow it down and push up costs greatly. But leaving that aside, we think there is a legal justification for the broad interpretation.
Alton, you get the last question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Alton Fry. This is not a leading question because I don't know where I want to lead you. You recall that the Carter administration spent so much political capital on the Panama Canal Treaty that it entered the SALT II ratification debate much weaker. The INF agreement is a very welcome development, but I wonder if you've considered, in consultation with the Soviets, the possibility that it might be wiser to delay the ratification process until after the Moscow summit to report on progress in the START negotiations so that the Senate can consider them as a part of the INF deliberation, perhaps two agreements together. Because otherwise you'll be spending so much of your energy and the Secretary of State's energy in the early part of 1988 that surely there's a danger the process will bog down.
It's a point I hadn't considered. We are going to have our plates full. You're quite right. If START unfolds as the Soviets, at least, we think it can unfold. I'm not sure, though, that the Senate would like that very much. That's something, the timing is something that we really should determine in conjunction with the Senate leadership so that we can best enhance the probabilities, the chances of ratification. Frankly, Alton, we're far too early in the process now for us to get into that kind of tactical consideration, but I'll take your suggestion under advisement.
Frank Carlucci, thank you very much.
You've been watching National Security Advisor Frank Carlucci address the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City. This program will re-air Tuesday morning on C-SPAN, beginning at approximately 6:50 a.m. Eastern Time. That's 3:50 Pacific.
Join C-SPAN Thanksgiving Day for American